My name is James Haywood. I'm from After Class, and you will also be meeting Chris later on in the presentation. So today I'll be looking at explaining how I go about teaching passive voice and also passive constructions in English. Most people feel that passive voice is a particularly easy area. However, not that I disagree. I think that if you want to teach the passive voice and passive meaning to a higher level, you also need to introduce these constructions that I will talk about. And I particularly want to look at the grammar as a teacher that you will need in order to A, teach it, but B, empower the student to then go on and do their own self-study, and C, most importantly, to be able to answer a student's questions effectively, because that ultimately is one of the most important things about teaching. Is it's one thing to demonstrate and have the student produce that language, but it's another to feel very confident as a teacher to respond to any question in a way that really assists the student. So I'll move on now to what we're going to talk about. First of all, very quickly, the aims of the webinar. Your goal as a teacher, obviously it's mostly to teach, but there I'll just go into that a little bit more in depth. I will define how I see the passive and the explanation that I give, or the definition that I give to students, that I ask them to, I kind of push this and get them to memorize it. What I feel you need to know as a teacher, then when we use the passive voice, other passive constructions, and the order in which I teach the passive. Now, clearly that's going to differ depending on the type of teacher you are, and naturally the students who you are teaching, especially around the age group. And if those students, for example, are studying primarily business or academic English or English for general purposes, you may teach it in a very different manner in which against what I do. And then finally, I'll give you a demonstration of how we go about using the product that we've created to teach the passive. So first of all, you need enough grammar as a teacher to be able to teach both passive voice but also passive constructions. And what I mean by passive constructions are something like he had the house painted, or I had my hair cut. So those are actually passive constructions, but they are not passive in meaning. The next thing I'll go on is ways that you can ways in which I can show you to teach the passive voice online, and also if you're teaching in a classroom or in-person tutoring, private one-on-one lessons. Your goals of a teacher obviously are to make teach the student to feel comfortable with grammatical terms. The passive doesn't use a lot of grammar. However, passive constructions do require an understanding of a number of grammatical terms, and this is where I find that a lot of teachers, as they teach to a higher level of proficiency, a lot of teachers start to slip in their ability to teach to those higher levels because they feel that you only need to know to be plus the past participle and the agent. And I think we need to go a little bit beyond that in order to teach passive constructions to a higher level of proficiency. The other big thing when teaching any area of grammar is to make the student understand both the form and the function. Students usually, depending on the culture, are very quick to understand the form. Some English can be reduced to almost a very short mathematical function, and people in particular use the passive in this way. And when I was discussing this with some teachers on LinkedIn, most teachers said, felt that the passive was one of the easy areas because you simply change the active sentence into a passive sentence and you move the object in the active to the passive, and that's all very well to show the form, but the function about when we use the passive is far harder to get into a production stage for a student. And ultimately, you want as a teacher to empower your students enough that they will use the passive voice confidently, spontaneously in natural speech. It's always easier than it sounds. And I also think to go on and do self-study, and to be able to answer perhaps some of the questions that they will have when you as the teacher aren't there, which obviously in life is the majority of the time. So what is the passive voice? I always take a step back from this for my students because what happens is when you first start with the passive voice, naturally, the passive voice, the student needs to know that they have probably been dealing almost exclusively previously with the active voice. And so what I do is go back and talk about terms with which a student is already confident. And these are, as I've listed in the definition here on the screen, is that the voice describes a relationship, and that relationship can change. So it's the relationship between the verb, the thing that does the verb, and the thing that receives the action of the verb. Now, it's not a very sophisticated definition. However, I think it works particularly well for students to understand a basic understanding of what voice and then what passive and active voice are, because we always have a verb, and then everything depends on the relationship as to whether it's active or passive. So that's the definition that I start with. It's very simple for them to memorize, and as you go along and teach the passive voice, you can come back to that because you're often talking about the relationship. Okay, next I'll go on and have a look at what is the passive voice exactly. Most people will say it's the reverse of the active voice, but in fact, as I will show you, it really depends on where we want to put the information in the sentence. And in English, I will explain something called the given new contract, which as native speakers, we like to use. So here we have, and I'll just let you know that anything that you can see on screen, especially in the pink format, they are a series of lessons. These are slides or images that have been taken from a series of lessons that I have created and posted on my website. You can have a look at these and see if they're suitable for you to use, but obviously if you're willing and ready to make your own lessons, then go ahead. So what I normally do is, as with most students, start with comparing the sentences and see what they can what a student already knows by eliciting, hopefully, that they will understand that by has been introduced in the passive sentence, and importantly, in this active sentence that we generally use, we're talking about a situation often where we don't know who, or it's unimportant or unknown who actually completed or carried out the action. So starting with the passive voice quite simply, as a teacher, what you need to know, and I think these are, it's the minimum of grammar that you need to know as a teacher to teach a student the passive voice and passive constructions, and also to be able to answer their questions. So fairly standard subject and object. Obviously, I think all teachers are comfortable with that. But coming down here, agent and recipient. And that relates back to, obviously, in a passive sentence, it's the agent that carries out the action of the verb, and the recipient receives the action of the verb. And this helps avoid the whole subject-object issue, which can become confusing at higher levels. The next thing that teachers really need to grasp in order for a student to get to a higher level of passive voice of constructions is the types of verbs that we have in English. And this should be introduced quite early. Students should understand the difference between transitive, intransitive, ditransitive, stative, and object complement verbs. Now, some of you out there will not use these terms. You will have a very different way of explaining it, but the point that I want to make is that students should understand that there are different groups of verbs in English. The reason is that not all verbs can be expressed in the passive voice, and perhaps the most difficult of all for students to grasp, although they often get the form very quickly, are ditransitive verbs. Ditransitive verbs are verbs in English that take two objects. The easiest example, or the simplest example to show you now is the verb to give. Give generally takes two objects. I gave the present to her. Two objects, one direct, one indirect. And the issue here is when that verb is converted to the passive, it can happen, there can be two expressions. You can either use the indirect object as the subject or the direct object as the subject in the active sentence. So I'll go through the properties that these verbs have and whether they can actually be used in the passive voice. Next, the given you contract. I mentioned that briefly. In English, this is something, it's a rule, I guess, that native speakers use unconsciously. When we talk in English and we start a conversation, once we get past the first sentence, every sentence that follows is affected by what's called the given new contract. And it essentially means that in English, after the first sentence, we prefer to start the second, third, and ongoing sentences with previously introduced information. And we like to push the new information to the end of the sentence. Now, what that means is the passive can be used quite often in this sense. I'll also talk to you about another principle. This really doesn't come into effect as a teacher until a very high level of proficiency, probably upper intermediate to advanced students, but the end weight principle is there are several areas in English where in order to avoid the processing of complex information, a native speaker will unconsciously move the way information is presented in a sentence in order to avoid the difficulties that follow for the listener to process that information. That was a fairly long-winded explanation, but I'll give you a demonstration of that also. It should be shown to students at a higher level, but it's not something that really, especially around academic writing, but probably not in a general purpose course. Then finally, and really importantly, you need to know about passive constructions. Passive constructions can be used with the passive voice, but also with an active voice. So, subject and object, I'm not going to sit on this for very long. I think everybody who's in the webinar this morning or today will already know that the general way to introduce passive often is that the object of the active sentence becomes the subject in a passive sentence. And it's pretty easy, so I won't harp on about that. I'll move on next to the agent and recipient. So here what happens is the object in the passive voice becomes the subject, and actually the doer and the receiver of the action change places. And this is where the words agent, the thing or the person that carries out the action of the verb, and the recipient to whom it's done or to what it's done becomes the important terms to be able to use. And obviously in English, we generally introduce the agent, not 100% of the time, but we generally introduce the agent with the preposition by. Okay, I'll get on to an area which some teachers have an issue with, and that is with the different groups of verbs. So I'll go through these not slowly, but to give you enough time. Obviously, you can search for these lists if you're not familiar with them on the internet. It's very easy to come across the groups of the different types of verbs. But here we're looking at an example that I would give to a student. All three sentences are what we call intransitive verbs. None of these sentences have an object. And so it's important that because they don't, just went a little bit too far there. Because they don't have an object, they're intransitive, or you may prefer the term no object verbs, which is very, it says a lot more to a student. And you can't use these in the passive voice. And a lot of teachers do fail to let students know about that. So one of the reasons I say about the types of verbs is remember that a student is more often than not learning when you are not around. And so if they start to use a dictionary, transitive and intransitive become very important for them to understand. So the next thing you've got are the verbs, ditransitive verbs. They are also known as two-object verbs. Two patterns for verbs with direct objects. Both of these examples that are underneath, there are two sentences. They are both shown in different ways, and of course you will notice that these are actually in the active voice. even when teaching passive constructions and passive voice, when I go and review the different types of verbs, I do it first using the active voice to show that here you have the man gave the book to the child, but underneath we have another ditransitive verb, but for this verb, the indirect object is introduced not with to, but for. Now, this is a great way to find ditransitive verbs in the English language. However, when the direct object comes directly after the verb in the active sentence, to and for do not appear. Lots of students will struggle with this in the active voice, but they really need to be aware that these verbs are ditransitive so that they can understand it can be expressed two ways in the passive voice. If you have a look perhaps at the sentence about the man gave the child the book, as a native speaker, you can very quickly understand that there are two possible sentences here. The child was given the book by the man, or the book was given to the child by the man. And this is quite complex for a lot of students to take in, especially because there are some other rules that some ditransitive verbs where the direct object is a person will not be placed, where the indirect object is a person will not appear in the passive. And this apparently is a difference between North American and British English. Something else that teachers need to know are object complement verbs. Complement is not a very popular word among teachers these days. We generally find that it's avoided by a lot of teachers and they'll use other ways to explain a complement. But if you have a look at these verbs underneath, I will always introduce object complement verbs. They are also called complex transitive verbs. And what happens is you can see that they are actually passive in meaning. She called him a thief is the same as he was called a thief by her. But we have a large group, well, perhaps not a large group, we have a group of verbs in English that are followed by a direct object and a complement. They are often reporting verbs, but here you can see that they get used in a passive sense. Okay, so moving on from the different types of verbs that we have, I'll just speak to you again about the given new contract. And essentially it states that native speakers will present old or given information first in a sentence. And that's after we've said the first sentence. This is particularly true in academic and more formal English writing. So I've got a definition up here that I give to students, or perhaps not a definition, an explanation. So we often use the passive when introducing new or important information if we are talking about who or what did the action. If you have a look on the left, we've got the standard active. And I always find that when I introduce the given new contract, I do give students a lot of controlled activities with a paragraph of text and simply ask them after the first sentence to rearrange second, third, and the ongoing sentences in the passive to move so that the given new given new contract applies and that language that is old information is coming to, the information that is old is coming to the front of the sentence. Two sentences on the left here. The thinker is one of the most important sculptures in the world, and Rodin sculpted it in 1880. It's correct, there is nothing wrong with this expression, except that in the majority of cases, a native speaker is going to automatically produce this, especially in formal and academic writing. What they will do is the new information that has been introduced will get pushed here. So we'll have a look at another example called the end weight rule. This essentially, without going into it too heavily, is something that you can look at higher proficiency levels, upper intermediate to advanced, where you have an extremely long noun phrase. In English, we prefer that the verb comes as quickly as possible at the beginning of a sentence. This is not the case in all languages. So be aware that as a native English speaker, you will prefer the verb in most instances right after the subject at the beginning of a sentence. And so if we didn't have this end weight rule in place, we would be asking people to process a huge amount of information, but the brain is listening to hear the verb. And so by using the passive, it is a construction at high levels of academic English that you can move the entire noun phrase, and you will need to change some of the construction, but it gets moved. So this is a really good thing. To actually teach it takes quite a lot of time, but I do think that students should be introduced to it so that, because perhaps the most difficult thing for students to understand is when native speakers prefer the passive voice. Okay, so using the passive voice is obviously something that we want our students to do. And a really easy way, and probably the most standard way of introducing it, is to describe processes, especially in writing. I think one of the most famous ones is about doing a process that occurs on a farm. It's very easy to convert. I think how milk is, in my lessons I do one around milk, the process behind making milk, or the process behind making chocolate, for example. It's very easy to get the students to write the steps down, and it's a very good moment to sit back and look a little bit at the grammar, especially because what's known as the past participle of these verbs, or what is also called today by many teachers verb 3, needs to be clear to the student. So here you can start with the passive voice being expressed, and the student is also starting to make a decision about whether to express the agent or not. Okay, here we are with an example of expressing introducing new information and using the passive. The English examples that I provide are always correct for the student. However, they do sound a little bit unnatural in that we need to apply the given new contract, and what I ask the student to do is to first of all identify what is the new information, and then how it appears again and again, and move that to the front of the sentence. Also at this time you will start to introduce whether we show the agent or not. Obviously here the agent, we're talking about a church that was built in the 7th century. More often than not, we don't know who actually constructed in historic terms, who actually physically constructed something. There are lots of other examples, but here you could start to teach that the agent is actually unknown, or I guess unimportant as well. Here we have another process using the passive. The passive actually allows us to avoid using someone, people, and they. Now, my understanding is that in some languages there isn't a passive that is used very often at all, and so that when students start to use the passive, naturally they will often avoid using the passive and instead create sentences with the subject being someone, people, and they. And you want to make that another reason for students to use the passive in English, is that the agent is either unknown, I don't know who grew these bananas, unimportant, I don't care, or understood. Both the speaker and the listener understand in the context who the agent is. So again, I tend to introduce quite a few processes here and give students the opportunity to express it both with and without the passive, and the context in which they feel that the agent would be expressed. And that's an important distinction. An important thing to follow up with. Once a student can do the form, you really want them to explain why they are choosing that function, why they prefer to leave or include the agent in the expression. Okay, coming on to the passive in complements. This is generally taught, I think, at an intermediate level or perhaps a little bit higher. But the main thing to introduce to students is native speakers like to use this construction or these verbs, particularly when they are services that we have paid for. So you can go on here, give some examples. These are generally not particularly difficult for students to learn, but it is an essential form to practice because we really do use this a lot in spoken English. And going on from there, you want to start looking at the other passive constructions. Sometimes you can have a passive in complements with get and have, and there is a difference in meaning. Both of them are valid uses of the tense, of the voice. So here we've got Benjamin got Lily fired from her job, and on the right hand side a sentence where have is used instead. Benjamin had Lily fired from her job. This is quite a difficult form for a lot of students to grasp. Not the form, but the actual difference in meaning is challenging for them to understand, because both of them in a sense are causative. Excuse me. In both instances, Benjamin got Lily fired from her job. He didn't do the firing. He isn't really the subject of this, but he did something that caused an effect on Lily. Now, the difference between got and had, or get and have here, is that in got, there is an idea that Benjamin is more involved in the action of the verb that took place. You could also look at two sentences like person A had person B killed, or person A got person B killed, whether it was by accident or by mistake or something else. There was an active role taken by the subject. We also use something called happenstance passives. This is when something unfortunate occurs, and we often use this in English. For example, I got caught by the speed camera. We often want to avoid using the passive here. We might just say I got fired or I got bitten. Okay, I got hit. It's when something unfortunate or unwelcome has actually happened to us. So that's another example of a passive or a happenstance passive. It's also, I think it is actually called the passive for unfortunate events. So coming on to the order in which I teach them, I tend to go passive voice with transitive verbs first and the agent, because you introduce the verbs for which all of them can be moved into the passive sense. The passive voice. Then passive voice without the agent, because actually in more than 50% of cases, especially in written English, the agent is not actually expressed. Then the passive with the given new rule. This allows students, A, to practice the principle that all native speakers employ, but secondly, with written English in controlled activities, you can actually start to practice the passive voice in a lot of different tenses. And it's really in writing where students will start to become with the compound passive tenses involving the present perfect passive or the past perfect passive. Even though they are generally less often used, they are still used in English, and it's when you can do them in controlled activities, especially around writing, that students start to get familiar with the compound forms. Then I introduced the ditransitive and the object complement verbs. Again, you can look for lists of these verbs on the internet. They are available on a number of websites, and in many cases students will already be familiar with these verbs, but it's important for them to understand how the objects in ditransitive verbs can both be the subject, both the direct and the indirect object. So there are two possible sentences, while in object complement there's a slightly different relationship. The difference then I go on for upper intermediate is the difference between get and be, and again for unfortunate events. As I said, I got bitten or I was hit. Passive construction, to have something done, again the services that we paid for, and then again to have and to get something done, where there is a difference in whether it was an accident or whether there was something more involved by the subject of the sentence. And I think that's probably over enough from me. So I'm going to pass you over to my business partner, Chris, who's going to explain a little bit about the online materials that we have available for people to use to teach both passive and naturally other areas of the language. And I think just before I move over, if anyone has any questions, we will be answering those just shortly after Chris has done a short demonstration. So thank you, and over to you, Chris.
Thanks, James. So I'm just going to show you a little bit around the site called OptiClass that myself and James founded, and all of the materials that James was highlighting today can be found on OptiClass. And the QA button at the bottom, if you have any questions about James's presentation, please leave your questions at the bottom and we'll formally take up the Q&A at the end of this short demo. So here we are on optclass.com, and this is our teacher page. And as you can see, it's split into a number of categories. And the passives, which James was going over today, are one of our categories. But then we have several other categories covering other areas of grammar, speaking activities, reading activities, vocabulary, and idioms. And when you're searching through the library, there's 370 lessons up here, so it's quite extensive. You can use our search function. So I typed in the passive there, and a number of lessons are coming up. Or you can browse the library. And you can also filter the library by levels. So you can select the level of the student that you're aiming for, and this will reveal the parts of the library that are appropriate for your student. So I'm going to come down into the passive section and open up the first passive lessons, Introduction to Passive. And I'm going to enroll the student I'm teaching today. I'm going to pretend I'm teaching Emily. And as we load the lesson, these are a number of notes that I've saved on Emily in the past. And this is the lesson. So you might be able to, as I flick through these, you might be able to recognize the slides from James's presentation, which was all taken from OptiClass. And as you move through the slides, you'll see the student's content on the right. This is the student's lesson content. This is effectively the lesson. And as you move, you'll see the teacher notes on the left. And the teacher notes coach you on how to teach each slide. So for slides that are exercises, such as this one, they provide you the answers. For slides that are more discovery-based or introduction-based, they provide you with extra speaking prompts, extra ideas, extra coaching tips on how to teach the slide. Now, if you want to teach the slides and you want to be able to access your teacher notes live while you're teaching, while hiding them from your students, if you're teaching online, you'll use this full screen button in the top right of the screen. And you press the full screen button, which pops up your teacher notes. The teacher notes popped up here as a separate browser window. And then if I take my main browser and on the left, make some space for the teacher notes. Now I can see the teacher notes as I'm moving through the slides while they're hidden from you, my students. If you're teaching in person, I'm just going to come back out of the full screen mode. If you're teaching in person, you can do the same thing. You can pop up your teacher notes using the full screen button, and then you're actually able to access the teacher notes on your mobile device. So you could imagine the implications if you're teaching live, whether it be in a classroom or a small group, or you're doing a one-on-one session with a private student. You could load the teacher notes on your smartphone, and then anytime you get to an exercise where you don't know the answer or you need a prompt, you need some help, you can casually look down at your smartphone and see the current active teacher note. So once we come to the end of the lesson, I'm going to close the classroom because I'm done teaching today. Now the system asks me if I want to send homework that is attached to this lesson and that is directly relevant on this lesson. So each of our lessons comes with a self-study activity sheet or homework that you can send to your student at the end of the lesson. So I'm going to choose to send the homework to my student. And now I'm going to show you what it looks like from the student's perspective. So when my student, Emily, logs into Off to Class, she gets the student view. And here is the homework assignment we just gave to her, introducing the passive voice. I'm going to launch the homework. And here's the self-study activity sheet. And at any time, Emily can access a summary of the lesson we just taught her by clicking this button, this red View Summary button up here. And here are the summary slides covering the main points from the lesson. Now I'm just going to fill in a couple answers. Passive, she won a medal in the competition. Active, of course. And I'm going to submit the homework to my teacher. Now when we go back to our screen as a teacher, we navigate to the Student tab here and click on Emily. And we can open up the homework assignment that she just submitted to me. Introducing the passive voice, submitted, completed. I'm going to open up her answers. And I like to take up the homework. I like to use Off to Class to take up the homework with my student live on the next lesson. It can be a great opener to close the last lesson that you just taught, spend 10 or 15 minutes bringing up the last lesson with your student. And as you can see, we've got Emily's answers on the right and the answer key on the left. And the answers on the right highlight, Emily's answers will highlight in orange if they differ from the answer key. So I got number 1 incorrect. The answer was actually active and I put it in passive. So I can use this notepad on the right here to leave live feedback for Emily. So here I'll say, just make a comment. And I can also use the notepad to leave general comments to Emily that aren't linked to any lesson. Good job, Emily. And I'll close the homework because I'm done taking it up with Emily, and I'll mark it as reviewed. And now, for the last thing, I will show you what Emily sees. Now, when Emily logs back in, she'll get a notification that we've reviewed her homework. And she'll be able to open up her reviewed homework in the bottom left here and see the comments that we've left her and see a copy of the answer key. So that is done with the demonstration. I will now pass it back over to James, who will take up the Q&A. And if anybody has any questions now, I'm just going to remind you there's a QA button at the bottom.